Okay, so
Sorry, honey.
it's January 17th, 2020. We're here at the farm with Mom and Dad, and I'm joining in on this particular story because I remember the topic, and even though we're kind of jumping ahead, this will be a good story. Anyway, so we were.
It started in Alaska.
Yeah, when we were in Alaska, I was 4 years old and 5 years old. Those 2 years, I was 4 and 5 years old. And in the last video that we were talking about comic books, and it just came out that we ended up talking about these classic comic books, which were a paperback little magazine, if you will, or a comic book. But it was of the classic stories, the Ivanhoes and
probably the Robe.
What's it on the Bounty? What is that story? The
Mutiny
on the Bounty, I think, was another one, and a variety of these classic books.
Robin Hood.
Yeah, these classic books that were made into smaller, shorter stories so that kids would be interested in learning the classics. So anyway.
They were written as a comic book with many times the actual words found in the
story,
the real volume that they were about. They were very well done. So
from my perspective, so that's why I wanted to be in on this one. Is from my perspective as a child, I wanted to. It was a treat. It was a treat because we were in Alaska and there was nothing to do in Alaska except be in the house for 9 months out of the year.
That's right.
And the other 3 months out of the year, it was just a muddy mess. And so a lot of our activity and thing was in the house. And so these magazines would just, Dad would get them, and I was very interested in them, if I recall correctly. And so Dad made it, as he did most often, he would make a game out of it. And so if I wanted to have another one, he'd say, well, there's a certain way that I get these magazines.
It was magic.
It was magic, is right. And so he would...
what I did, Chad.
Well, hold on. Let me tell you my side, and then you can tell the truth. As a child, it was magical to me because he would go to this place, and I don't know if it was in a room or in the hallway or in a closet, but he would come back, and these magazines, these classic comics would magically appear. And I got more and more intrigued over time to say, well, where is he getting these? And so I would ask him, and finally he relented and said, okay, here's how you get the magazines. Here's how you get these classic comics. And he'd go to this place, and he would say, first of all, you touch your hand here, and then you touch your hand over here, and then you touch your hand over here, and he would pull out a magazine. It was magic. And like most other things, I'm sure he was so intrigued and tickled with himself that he was able to make this happen to a young child. And so he would say, okay, now you try it. And so I would put my hand here, and then I would put it over here, and I would touch this, and obviously no magic happened. But it was something that was so intriguing to me and so much fun when Dad would go get these classic magazines. So go ahead, Dad. You can tell.
They were purchased for a reason, because they were very, very effective in waiting rooms, or when you're having dental patients wait. And so that's what they were really purchased for. But we would always bring them through the home first, because Chad and Todd and even Daphne just loved me to sit and read it to them. And then later they could learn to read, and they loved just reading them. But eventually they ended up in my office there in Boise, and that's where they kind of ended up losing them as far as quality, because they're worth an awful lot of money right now, the classics. And the way I did that is I would hide them in the closet there in I think our bedroom, but I'm not sure.
There was like a water
hallway.
heater or some sort of a machinery or something
but
in
is
the.
this in Alaska?
That's what I remember was in Alaska.
It has to be in Alaska. And you
Anyway, I would reach in and have them stored there that I would get one out. And I think I bought them about 10 at a time, and then only bring out once, one at a time, until we become thoroughly acquainted with that volume.
That story.
And so to this day, I find that comic books are a real good way of introducing the classics books to any child. I learned this now that my mother bought one on the Old Testament, the Old Testament stories, all done in comic book style, and it was about an inch thick, all done in comic book style. And many times I was designated to herd the cows along the sides of the road there on Linder Road. We didn't have enough pasture to take care of 35, 40 cows. And so we had turned them loose, and we had to herd them down the road so they'd eat the grass in the bar pits and on the sides of the road. And you had to wait there, and so you just sit there and watch, because these cows were all very, very tame and very obedient and wouldn't go through and get on to other people's property. So I would just sit and find a place to sit down, and I would bring that Old Testament comic book. Like I said, it was very thick, story after story after story in the Old Testament's done to comic book style. And that was how I learned the Old Testament stories. In fact, it became quite valuable when I became a seminary teacher in Meridian later in life. And I taught for all 4 years, and each year they changed the subject, Book of Mormon, Old Testament, New Testament, and
church history.
Yeah, the church history, which was Doctrine and Covenants. And when I got into the Old Testament, I mean, those stories that I read as a child came back, and I could visualize what I was reading because of what I read when I was a child. So they're that valuable. And the same thing will hold true if you have the classic comic books on Robin Hood or Ivanhoe or any of those, Tale of Two Cities. There's so many of them that were done in classic form.
The Scarlet Letter.
Yeah. And sometimes you had never read the book. Other times you had read the book. You need to know also that I love to read. In fact, when I was in the 1st and 2nd grade, I read many classic books done for that age bracket. I remember 1 year there, and I think it was the 3rd year, that I read 30 books in that 1 year, because I love to read these stories about Sergeant Preston and Call of the Wild and horse stories, Black Beauty. Anyway.
Well, just really quickly, back to the Old Testament, I remember as a child that we did have family home evening regularly, and our parents taught us the Old Testament, and it was because of family home evening and things that I had a good memory of the Old Testament stories as well.